Hi everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that today I'll be taking from an article I wrote from my LinkedIn newsletter series, which I call Trends in Forest Analytics. Now, I try to post a new article to that LinkedIn newsletter feed weekly, and so if you haven't subscribed, I definitely encourage you to. There's lots of easy ways to do it. I like it because it can hit your inbox once I publish a new article, and you can obviously also read it on LinkedIn and engage with me that way. And so I'll include a link to that LinkedIn newsletter in the show notes, and looking forward to seeing you on there.
Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry.
Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about an issue that's really of importance to folks in the United States, and that is the recent report on greenhouse gas emissions and removals from U.S. forests. And so all of these data are compiled by the USDA Forest Service and are given out in a report every year to get a sense of how well forests do in sequestering and storing carbon. How much do they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And what is that in relation to all of the greenhouse gas emissions from driving our cars, operating transportation, and everything else in the U.S. economy? And so they recently released their latest report. I'll have a link to that in the notes. And today I just want to talk about how valuable this report is, and a couple of key takeaways from the numbers in that report. And so just as background, every year the USDA Forest Service reports out this economy-wide inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And it comes out, and it's a great report, and it provides an overview of the status and the trends in greenhouse gas emissions and removals from forests, woodlands, harvested wood products, and urban trees in the United States. And so this is a great report that summarizes, when you can say something like the amount of carbon dioxide that our forests sequestered was 13% of all economy-wide emissions. Those numbers come from this report. And so this is an important report that a lot of people look at and a lot of people are interested in having their eyes on. Now, this report, I think, is especially valuable because it reports the year 2020. And obviously, that was the first year of the pandemic really affecting the U.S. for pretty much all of the year, in earnest really since March of that year, all the way through to, obviously, to the end of December. And the numbers, at least in terms of, when the economy-wide emissions are lower, that is, there's not as much greenhouse gas emissions because lots of places were shut down and lots of different places were at least in reduced travel. We didn't fly as much. We didn't commute to work as much. A lot of people were working from home. And so the pandemic disrupted the economy in a big way, and that results in how much our forests had the capacity to take in that carbon dioxide. And that's really the first takeaway from this report, is that in the global pandemic, forests sequestered a larger share of emissions. And so in the 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic obviously disrupted all those economies. If you look at the total carbon dioxide emissions from the United States in 2020, they're almost 13% less than what they were in 2019 or pre-pandemic. And so obviously, if forests are doing the same work and there's not as much emissions going into the atmosphere, those lower economy-wide emissions are going to make the role of forests in offsetting carbon look all that much better. And so the numbers from this year indicate that forests, urban trees, and harvested wood products removed 16.3% of all CO2 emissions in 2020. And as to kind of put that number in perspective, the pre-pandemic number was 14% in 2019. And so you can immediately see the role, just by not having as much CO2 emissions, forests are able to sequester more of all of the CO2 emissions that happened in our country. And so that's a really important number, and I think is really going to be used as a benchmark as we kind of are coming out of this pandemic. And obviously these data again are from 2020. but what happens in 2021, 2022, compared to those pre-pandemic levels, I think a lot of people are going to be interested in. The second big takeaway from this report is just the increasing role of Western fires and how they account for a large amount of emissions in the United States forest sector. And so 2020, again, was another bad year for fires. Lots of fires in Oregon, California. According to some estimates, the total area burned from all the fires in the western United States was 4.2 million acres. And the greenhouse gas emissions from those fires were at their highest level in the 30-year reporting period for this report, going back all the way to 1990. And so you can think about just the tremendous impact that fires have on forest emissions. Obviously, wildfires result in a near immediate impact and kind of input into CO2 into the atmosphere, and certainly the trees that are charred and left behind will be decaying through time. And so it's one of the most widespread forest disturbances, and it continues, that is, those wildfires continue to contribute a tremendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And so those western fires play a huge role in emissions from forest lands, and they did again in the 2020 reporting year. The third thing that's highlighted in the report are just that private forests are carbon sequestration machines. What is new to the report this year, which I really love, are estimates of forest carbon stocks and stock changes by different forest ownership groups. And so they're separated out only for private and public. And for those of you familiar with some of the National Forest Inventory data that the United States have, you can actually subset those even further. But this report just shows them by public and private, which still is quite revealing and really showcase the value of both public and privately owned forests. And so if you look at all the private forests in the United States, about 58% of the total area is in those private forests. However, those private forests account for 84% of the carbon sink strength in 2020. And so that's just an incredible amount. So those private forests are doing a much greater job than public forests in terms of contributing to the overall sink strength in the United States. And obviously, the majority of that sink strength came from where the forests are growing the most. And anyone that works in the U.S. knows that those are mostly privately owned forests in the South. You know, you think a lot of highly productive forests in southern pine, and that forest type alone removed 326 million metric tons of carbon dioxide alone. And so just, I think the value that this report now shows of private forests and just the importance they have in sequestering carbon across our whole economy. And then another thing, the fourth thing to be thinking of that came from this report is just the changing role as we go from forests being carbon sinks to carbon sources. That is, those that have a negative carbon flux, that is, they're removing more CO2 from the atmosphere, versus those that are emitting more CO2 to the atmosphere, basically being a carbon sink or a carbon source. And so the great thing that this report shows is the data going back to 1990, and there's an excellent set of data tables where you can really dive in by state and by some of these other groups or other variables like ownership group and even region in the United States. One aspect it reveals is that the decreasing carbon sink strength in public forests throughout the United States. And so I've made a graph that I'll share in the notes, but it basically shows the different trends by 4 different regions: the northern part of the United States, Pacific Coast, Rocky Mountain, and South. And it shows that the carbon sink in public forests in the North, Pacific Coast, and South regions continues to decrease compared to at least what they were in 1990. And so obviously if those trends continue, there's a possibility that those publicly owned forests could become a net source of carbon rather than a net sink. And so those public forests in the Rocky Mountain region are always struggling. They continue to operate as a net source of carbon. Obviously, the Rocky Mountains in the United States has seen a large number of forest disturbances, such as wildfires from lots of wildfires that have been ongoing for the last several decades. and insect damage, things like the mountain pine beetle impacting that region heavily. And that has led to a lot of variability in carbon flux, especially in the last 10 years. And so it's a great showcase this report does to indicate just those trends in carbon flux by ownership group and region over the last 30-year period. And so there you have it. I think the big things to take away are just how good forests look, and in terms of a pandemic, for sequestering a larger share of the emissions, the important role of fires in the western U.S. in terms of contributing to emissions from forest lands, just the overall power of privately owned forests in carbon sequestration, and the kind of warning sign to be looking at to understand carbon sinks and carbon sources, and how some of our forests may be transitioning to sources based on their trends over the last 30 years. And so that does it. I'll share a link to the report in the notes. I urge you to have a look at it and to see how it might impact the forest near you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.